Welcome to our 3 Dubs, where your favourite fanfiction stories come to life through immersive text-to-speech narration. Sit back, relax, and let the words take you on an unforgettable journey. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss a new story. Chapter 5 Tension. Present day. The overcrowded plane had a now flight back to New York. The passengers were forced to sit across from each other on benches along each wall. Steve had the best vantage point with his back to the cockpit in a single seat adjacent to the bench along the east wall. Loki was cuffed in the corner right next to him and was flanked by Bucky and then Sam. Tony and Rhodey were at the back of the plane, on the opposite side, and Marie and Thor sat directly across from Sam and Bucky. With his eyes hiding behind sunglasses, Steve stared at the other occupants the FBI reluctantly had to accommodate. Even though no guns were drawn, Steve thought the tension in the air compared to the feeling of a hold-up. Everyone looked like a cornered animal to some extent, waiting to pounce at the chance to continue their arguments from before. The situation was a mess and was bordering on a disaster. Not a single person on the plane, except for the criminal, could have predicted a few hours ago that the 8 individuals would all be together in a confined space once again. The last thing Steve told Loki before boarding was, "You should seriously consider exercising your right to remain silent." To his surprise, everyone was actually practicing their right to silence. But this hushed environment did not provide any peace or calm. Instead, the air was stiff and thickened with each passing second. Being around the people in the plane, when they hadn't been together like this in years, triggered a memory in Steve. He thought back to the morning of his first day at the academy. That morning in the hotel before they left for training, they were all in the lobby sizing each other up. The 8 individuals were doing the same exact thing on the plane right now, each looking out for their own agency or their own agenda. And each person was waiting to see who would speak first. A couple minutes passed as the flight took off. The passengers were processing the events of the last hour, so silence was to be expected at first. But then another 5 minutes passed, and a metaphorical bomb began to loom as time ticked away, threatening to blast heightened emotions all across the cabin. If their history could prove anything right now, it was that the quiet would not remain much longer. Too many foxes were in this hen house, and someone was going to show their teeth soon. So only one question mattered: who was going to talk first? Bucky thought to himself that Loki would be the first to instigate, while Sam predicted Tony would start. Another 5 minutes passed, and Maria bounced her knee and started picking at her cuticles nervously. An old habit that Sam picked up on right away. Her actions were caused by an annoyance, knowing the slam mine was about to go off. Thor had his elbows on his knees as he rubbed his temples. Rhodey looked like he was lost in his own thoughts, almost having a conversation with himself. And then there was Stark. Steve hadn't moved an inch in his seat. He didn't flinch once behind his glasses. But Tony kept his shades on too, mirroring Roger's position at the back of the plane. Steve couldn't see his eyes, but he knew Stark was concentrating on him. They were friends, good friends a long time ago. It wasn't easy then, since they were born with qualities, placing them at natural odds with each other. Tony's flash and showmanship to Roger's good nature and subtlety. Stark's need for the spotlight and attention to Steve's need for authenticity and morals. Tony's growing up with money to Steve's growing up without. That chasm between their differing personalities only grew since separating as FBI team members. It was ironic. The distance separating the 2 men on the plane right now echoed the distance in their friendship since Tony joined the CIA. They were as far away from each other as they could be because the relationship was non-existent. The last 5 minutes of quiet passed, and it felt like a pressure cooker. No one had spoken a single word since boarding, but the timer was about to go off. In total, 17 minutes of silence had ticked away. In hindsight, that length of time could be measured as a success in somewhat reality. The fact these strong-willed individuals could even last 17 seconds without talking was surprising. Bucky sighed as he saw Loki out of the corner of his eye. The criminal was grinning ear to ear right now, clearly reveling in the brewing madness since his arrest. Steve's jaw twitched as he heard Loki's intake of breath, knowing he was going to make a move and break the silence. "If I were a betting man, I would have lost a lot of money today." "I would never have guessed you imbeciles could manage to keep your traps shut for this long," Loki said. 7 pairs of eyes snapped toward him as Rogers reached to where he was cuffed. Grabbing Loki's thumbs, Steve forced them back toward his wrist. He spoke so close that his beard almost touched Loki's face. "You're a smart man, Loki. You always have been. So, use that brain of yours and think long and hard before you say anything else." Steve released his grip and moved back to his seat, but the spark in Loki's eye was an indicator to everyone. He was just getting started. "You really are taking this hold on T-fuck with Roger's trope seriously good. You always needed a little dirt on that crisp and clean moral code of yours. Tell me, Cap, when did you start smudging your persona exactly?" Bucky clenched his fist as Loki turned his head towards him. "Oh, Barnes, always looking out for your dear brother. What a good little boy you are. Tell me, how is that little boy of yours?" Loki was talking out of his ass, with the sole purpose of antagonizing anyone within range of his words or eyesight. Everyone knew that, but it didn't matter when an individual's emotional temperature was reaching a boiling point. The mention of someone else loved one by Loki, especially a child, eliminated any chance of calming the atmosphere. It didn't matter to Barnes that it was an empty statement. A flash of rage filled Bucky for a moment before he lunged at him. Sam held him back and forced him to change seats with him, whispering to his friend, "Bucky, don't you have to keep your cool for another half hour. This is exactly what he wants." Sam nudged his head towards the back of the plane, indicating a reminder of what Fury had told them to play in the same sandbox with everyone on the plane, but not to trust them. Loki laughed. "What, Sammy? You don't think they can hear you?" Peeking his head around Wilson to look at Stark and Rhodey, and then Thor and Hill, Loki mocked, "I mean, if they can hear something 10 feet away from them, I seriously question the competence of this country as government officials." After a couple of seconds, Loki grinned at the glaring daggers around him. "Oh, I think they can hear me just fine. What a relief. My faith in democracy is restored." Stark spoke next. "You'll be lucky to have any faith left in your ability to breathe by the time I am through with you, Loki. 15 minutes, that is all I'll need." Quiet time had officially expired. Bucky turned and raised his voice. "Always so tough, Stark. It is easy to act that way when you work in the shadows of the CIA, avoiding the real fight." Hill tried to step in, but Sam cut her off. "Cut the diplomatic act, Maria. I know you're still trying to work on a way to get Loki in your custody at Homeland. You ain't not fooling anyone." "Okay, Sam. I was trying to be the level-headed one here," Maria answered as Thor spoke over them. "Loki's clearly trying to get under your skin. Maybe if the FBI learned to play well with others like the NSA and Homeland do when it is needed, this wouldn't be so hard for you." Rhodey jumped in. "Thor, that's about the stupidest thing I've ever heard you say. And I've heard my fair share of dumb shit from your mouth over the years. The NSA is out for their own blood just like all of us." True words couldn't have been spoken, but the plane erupted anyway with displaced anger. Flames were flung at each other like mud off of a tire, going in all different directions. Rhodey called Sam a G-man. Sam accused Maria of being a political suck-up, caring more about her job title than crime. Thor yelled lackey at Barnes. Rose and Stark had insults tossed their way from everyone, Ghost, Spook, and Black Site assholes to name a few. "Why don't you stop by one of our black sites and see if you can make it a day, Barnes?" Stark dared. Everyone was yelling except for Steve. He stayed out of it at first, but as always Tony crawled under his skin. He cocked his head towards Stark. "Always such a tough man when you can hide behind words, Stark. You can think what you want about the FBI having rules and order, but the truth is you've been cutting corners and playing by your own rules your entire life. That has only been amplified in the CIA. I want you to think about that, Tony. Do you really feel good about the questionable tactics you've performed since becoming a spook?" Stark took off his sunglasses and stepped towards Steve, just as righteous as you always were, Rogers, hiding behind that FBI badge. "Don't talk to me about questionable actions. My tactics are minor stretches of the imagination, unlike some people." Steve's face turned red as he stood up. "Why don't you try me, Stark? Keep talking, and we'll all see who is hiding in a few minutes." The silence from before was replaced by everyone trying to one-up the last insult by screaming over one another. Loki narrowed his eyes. "Look at you. A little nudge, and you pull each other apart like cotton candy. Pathetic. I must say, this is not the family reunion I expected. It is so much better." The shouting stopped as all eyes glared directly at the reason they were there in the first place. They weren't just dealing with a criminal or the government agencies right now. They were dealing with a shit ton of baggage from their past. They all seemed to realize nothing was going to get accomplished by highlighting that baggage right now. "Jesus Christ," Bucky muttered. 15 minutes, Tony whispered to Rhodey as they returned to their seats. Silence returned to the cabin as everyone took stock of what just happened. Steve pinched the bridge of his nose as he buckled back into his seat and looked at his watch, thinking to himself, "Great, 20 minutes left still. 7 former team members, 4 government agencies, and Loki, what a mixed bag." They had boarded the plane ramped up with emotional dynamite, and Loki was thrilled to light the fuse. 12 years ago, Steve Rogers could blame many things for his struggles with sleeping. Recollections of being a sickly child coughing and wheezing through the night unsettled him at times, no matter how healthy he was now. Memories from his toddler years would flash at times as he remembered his abusive father causing his head to stir in the dark. And every time he thought of those years, Steve felt more pain from remembering his mother and Bucky being hurt than himself. Traumatic and macabre images were seared in his brain from Afghanistan and from war, occasionally causing night terrors. A therapist told Steve that he suffered from mild PTSD. Bucky did as well, but what else was new to anyone who had an early childhood like theirs and had been through war? Regardless of those memories, Steve learned how to deal with each ordeal. He was blessed to have his health turn around as it did when his age reached double digits, and he learned to live a very healthy and fit lifestyle because of it, not wasting the blessing. A driving force to protect and to stand up for people formed early on inside of him because he remembered when he couldn't defend himself and his loved ones. He and Bucky were raised by their loving and devoted mother Sarah, who helped them deal and grow from the suffering instilled from his father. He and Bucky saved each other growing up, always being there for each other. And they saved each other as asses in the military too, along with countless missions, troops, and citizens of other countries, which only helped the security of their own country. So, having a side effect of a random bad dream was worth it, because they had helped a greater cause in their minds. When Steve woke up this morning, his restlessness was not caused by any of the common culprits. Sunrise. That was the last thing Natasha said to Steve the night before when they agreed to meet at dawn for a run. It was 3-0 now. So now. None of his past sufferings forced his eyes open to this moment. He laid awake because of anticipation. He laid awake because of arousing images of lips, skin, and bodies against a brick wall last night. He laid awake because of how good it felt to feel whatever this was, something he'd never felt before. He laid awake because of Natasha Romanoff. Steve looked over at Sam and Bucky to see they were out cold, and he decided he couldn't stay in bed any longer. He reached over to the nightstand and drank some water. He stood up, put his sweatshirt and pants on, and left his room. Needing some fresh air, he decided to go for a walk outside. He walked up the hill in between the two housing units, then sat down on the grass. Staring up at the stars with the moon bright overhead, he heard the snap of a stick behind him. When he turned around, he saw the woman that caused him to be awake at this hour, standing only a few feet from him. Natasha came closer and sat near him on the grass but kept a safe distance, and here I was thinking that you were maybe more of a night owl than an early riser, Rogers. Sometimes I don't sleep the best, especially when I have a lot on my mind. Steve smiled at her. She hummed in a response and drew her legs up as she rested her chin on her knees. Yeah, I didn't sleep much either. She could feel his eyes on her as she looked out into the night sky. That similar tension started to return in the air and space between them. They spoke simultaneously. Steve, I think, and Natasha, we need. A pause stirred in the silence before she looked over at him and they both let out a nervous laugh. She said, You first, soldier. Steve's hand scrubbed over his smooth jawline as he blew out the breath. You re-feeling this too, right, Natasha? With her legs tucked and her head tilted towards him, she simply shook her head in agreement. There were moments from the previous day, when she was arguing with Stark or fighting with May or himself, that Steve thought Natasha looked older than her age of 22. Like whatever was in her head had weathered her well beyond her physical years. But right now, in the moonlight with her luminous gaze, the time in between night and morning, and when the outside noise was stripped down to just the two of them, he couldn't help notice how incredibly young she looked. Their eyes met again. Steve's anticipation and restlessness created conflicting feelings. Look, Natasha, we're adults, and we are in the FBI training program. This is too important to jeopardize for both of us. He could tell when they spoke at the same time a moment ago that she was going to say something similar to him because a little relief came across her face. But he wanted to be open and honest with her at least as much as he could without scaring either one of them with the intensity of his feelings. He said, But I want you to know whatever is going on between us is also too important to jeopardize. I know that sounds kind of crazy since we met just a few days ago. A look of surprise came across her face, followed by a blush causing her to look down at the ground. He told her what he was thinking. Now the ball was in her court. He could tell she was struggling with what to say right now, and a little voice of panic started running through his head. Maybe she doesn't feel the same way, and she was coming out here to tell me to stay the hell away from her. I don't know what you want from me, Steve. I didn't come here for fun or to meet people. I came here to join the FBI, so I agree the focus should stay on our training. It is too important to jeopardize. Okay, that is not the entirety of the point he was trying to make. Part of it, yes, but he was really just trying to tell both of them to cool down a little. Natasha, that's not all I was trying to say. Steve started, but she shook her head and said, Let me finish. She lifted her head and turned toward him. He could tell she was nervous. She crossed her legs and finally looked in his eyes again, breathing uneasily. Steve, I didn't plan or expect any of this. I know you didn't either. I am not used to the unexpected. Steve scooted closer to her. Believe me, Natasha, with as big of a control freak as I am not used to it either. The physical attraction is obviously there between us. Obviously, huh? Natasha grinned, and here I thought you didn't have a big ego. Steve laughed quietly, and the ease between them settled back in. I don't have an ego, but I am not dead. And I don't think I am wrong with what I just said either. Not knowing where he was going with this, she smirked. You don't think you were wrong that I am attracted to you, huh? Okay, I'll take the bait. Yeah, you read pretty easy on the eyes, Roger, so what do you want? Another laugh, but this one was erring on the side of worry. His words weren't coming out right. Romanoff, I am not fishing for compliments. And I am not looking for us to hook up. I mean, not just hook up, Natasha reached over and grabbed his hand, giving a gentle squeeze. Steve, I was teasing. I think it is safe to say that yet there is a strong physical attraction between us. He let out a frustrated breath as he looked down at their hands. A second passed. Rubbing his thumb over the back of her hand, he said, let me try this again. As obvious as all of that may be, it is not what I care about. There is obviously something else, a connection between us. And as much as the thought of us kissing in public helped keep me awake the last 3 nights, the thought of getting to know you more was much more exciting. She chewed on her lip as she stared at their joined hands. You might not like what you find. Steve, who do you want me to be? Squeezing her hand a little harder, he answered, how about a friend? She locked eyes with him as he continued, Natasha, we just need to get used to being around each other. The physical stuff could be an unneeded distraction during training, but it is not like we can join separate programs. I meant it the other day, and I mean it now. I want us to try and be friends. I am not the best at making friends, Steve, Natasha said. Honestly, he wasn't too surprised with her answer. The way she had snapped at him yesterday when he tried to help her multiple times had independent and please do not disturb written all over her actions. But the way she said it now sounded so flat, like it was a fact. His brow creased as the same concern he had for her yesterday returned. He didn't want to argue, and he didn't want the conversation to go sour, so he joked, well, before 3 days ago, I didn't think I would be any good at PDA, but look at how well that turned out. She snapped out of her thoughts and laughed as he continued, look, I think we can show a little self-control, right? I can do it if you can, no matter how easy on the eyes I am. He winked at her, trying to keep it light. She hesitated before adding, and if all else fails, what cool showers? Daily ice baths. He smiled, you know, I hear those can be relaxing. I think it is worth it to try. Being friends, that is. She smiled and pulled her hand away, nervously picking some blades of grass from ground. I think I like the sound of that, Steve, so we start with morning runs together. She wasn't running or retreating like she had the first night. She told him last night she wasn't going to, but she was reaffirming the sentiment now, which caused relief to flow through him. Yeah, Natasha, morning runs or extra training sessions. We can help each other in the academic area here. I can help you in weapons assembly. She grinned as she cut him off. You see, might need help, Rogers. John, you mean you could learn something from me? Steve laughed. I think we can learn from each other. How about every morning at 5:0 and we trade off and on with the sessions? One day a run, the next would be tactical, the next weapons, the next academics, and so on. She nodded in agreement. And if we want to join up together for an evening jog, then so be it. Steve added, and whatever else comes in between, we'll figure it out together. Together, Natasha repeated. The tension was still there, but a comforting familiarity started to form between them two. They broke into a more normal conversation and started laughing at something Bucky had joked about the night before. They guessed who would excel in the academic session starting later today, as they both said Maximoff and laughed. They didn't touch each other again for the remainder of the early morning, but somehow they were closer to each other than before. As the sun rose around 5:0, Steve looked at his watch and said, time for our run, Natasha. He paused for a second and smiled. Are you sure about this? She answered, sure, it'll be fun. A month had passed at Quantico. Steve and Natasha's plan to spend more time with one another worked seemingly well during that month. Their days started with their 5:0 runs and practice sessions. Steve did help her with weapons, and she helped him improve in boxing. Without mentioning it, they stayed away from the combat sessions at first. They knew they'd find themselves in compromising positions, and they really were trying to form a friendship. A friendship was forming. They started eating together every morning, noon, and night, sometimes with the group and sometimes on their own. They gravitated toward each other at other times by sitting together in a classroom, going on nightly walks and runs, and partnering up whenever the situation allowed. Besides spending a large amount of time together, Steve and Natasha started bonding outside of training. Inside jokes developed. Their flirtatious tone was constant, but there were other things too. Natasha saw a couple of tattoos on his muscular arms while boxing, and Steve caught a glimpse of a scar on her clavicle along the left side. Steve wasn't a picky eater, but preferred a meat and potatoes diet if he had a choice. Her taste buds were more expensive, favouring spices, sweets, and vodka. She loved playing games as much as he did, which only funneled their competitiveness outside of training. He started calling her Ned at times. She really liked to call him Soldier when she was in a joking mood. She learned about his hobby of drawing when she saw smudges on his hand and cheek one morning for their 5-0 training. He dismissed it at first. "It's nothing really. It's just something that keeps my mind busy sometimes." She raised her eyebrow and was intrigued, but left it at that. He started to realize how much she loved to tease him in general. "All those big and sweaty muscles with no flexibility, it's like you want me to trap you," she would often tell him in some variation while boxing. He was strong, but she was quick and agile, often able to dance away from his advances in the ring. He gave as good as he got, though, as Natasha realized almost immediately, something that Bucky had known since they were kids. She learned that Steve Rogers, as upstanding and as good of a person as he was really a man from Brooklyn at heart. And he had the attitude at times to prove it. In short, he could be a little shit when he wanted to, with his smirks, comebacks, and teasing remarks towards her. "Maybe I do want you to trap me, Nat. What are you going to do about it?" was a favourite response of his. The first time he said it, she felt a heat spread from her spine, straight to her stomach, and then to her cheeks. The blush was hidden by her already red and sweaty face, but still. She called their session early that morning and went to find the solution of a cold shower quickly. The cold water wasn't relaxing like Steve had joked, but it was effective. On a deeper level, though, Steve started to trust Natasha as the month wore on. He opened up about some darker and serious memories during their quieter times together. On a walk 2 weeks ago, he told her about his abusive father and how he feels guilty, on some level to this day, that he couldn't protect his mum and Bucky. And he also feels like it was a blessing in disguise when, the bastard, passed away from liver failure when he and Bucky were 7. She didn't say anything when he told her, but she did hold his hand with an understanding that he didn't ask about, and she didn't elaborate on. Steve confided in her by talking about his struggles he still deals with from his time overseas in Afghanistan. He and Bucky shared these memories and struggles, but hardly ever discussed them anymore. So it surprised him when he thought about what opening up to her meant, that he really trusted her. But what was even more surprising was that he didn't think about the meaning hardly at all. The trust, the friendship, the time spent together, it all felt natural and organic and easy. Like what they said was actually true, they just needed to spend more time together to get used to their connection. Natasha, on the other hand, she was private. Much more private than Steve even was. He didn't mind now. Or at least he told himself that he wasn't bothered. He was so engrossed in spending time with her and creating memories in the here and now that he didn't try to dwell on not knowing much about her past. He soaked up any crumb of information she gave him and tried to be patient. He could tell she had dancing in her background from her gracefulness, lean muscles, and flexibility in the boxing ring. A couple of cold showers were definitely needed on Steve's part as well over the last month, when his mind wandered towards those flexible and lean muscles. Yes, the cold showers were definitely effective. But he also found that she was incredibly smart and gifted in so many of the areas they were being trained on. Noticing those talents instead of being told by Natasha made Steve think back to Stark's argument with her that first night around the fire. "What is your story?" Stark had asked. Steve never pressed Natasha for more information though. He could be patient. He would be patient with her because he knew she'd tell him more when she was ready. He wasn't infallible though. Some occurrences began etching away at his patience. She made vague references about not being able to trust people easily and about feeling alone in the world as a child. When Steve made a comment a few days ago about not having a father, she said, "Just be thankful you and Bucky have a mother who loves you enough to make up for the sins of the past." Natasha had been staring at the moon when she said it. He didn't ask because it was like she was in a different world, and it slipped out. He knew the words conveyed a lot more than what they physically spelled out. He had a hunch that abuse, or bad parents, or something dark had infected her childhood as well, but he didn't want to pressure her. Instead, he reached down and held her hand with an understanding, just as she had a couple weeks before with him. Natasha let a few other puzzle pieces escape, making Steve wonder. She would bring up his and Bucky's childhood friends, or ones from the military that he often talked about, and comment how lucky he was to have that type of companionship. She referenced how he was so likable and how everyone here gravitated toward him. Natasha started hanging out with everyone more in the group and had even become friendly with Maria, Wanda, Bucky, and Sam, but he guessed the friendships were not common in her life. She also stated a couple of times how family was really important. He would talk about his mother or Bucky a lot, but when she mentioned family, it seemed like there was nothing but that in her life. Maybe he was reaching, but it was difficult when he had so little information to go on. The last thing that he started to pick up on was something that only he noticed. If someone else had noticed, like Stark, she would have been relentlessly asked about it. It only happened a few times. But when Natasha got really frustrated, upset, or competitive with him, Steve heard what almost appeared to be a faint accent. A few of her R's rolled in these more heated times. A couple of vowels were drawn out in an elongated drawl. And one time last week, when Steve jabbed her shoulder unsuspectingly in the ring, he swore he heard a single word in a foreign language. It was under her breath and in a low tone as she was walking away from him. But if his life depended on it, he thought she probably swore at him in Russian. Again, he didn't ask about it, but it all made him wonder. He did trust her. He just wished she trusted him more. Steve was a two-dimensional puzzle that Natasha was gathering pieces to over their first month. Slowly, she was learning the big picture of who Stephen Grant Rogers was as a person. Natasha, though, she was a three-dimensional chessboard with constant moving pieces. Every piece of information that Steve gathered, he salivated over, chewed up, and committed to permanent memory. But every new piece created 5 more questions. For example, take the word he heard her say under her breath a few days ago. He would bet his life savings it was Russian. When did she learn Russian? In high school? Why did she learn it? Did she study overseas? Were her parents from there? And the spiral continued. Where Steve gave Natasha information willingly about himself, he only found information about her through deductive reasoning, vague statements, observational skills, or slip-ups. Real information. Not surface-level details like hobbies or food or favourite colours. Details and memories that formed who you were as a person. He had to find all of the real pieces out on his own, and he wasn't even sure if the things he thought he figured out were accurate. It was intriguing, intoxicating, encompassing of his thoughts, and was beginning to become frustrating. What else was becoming increasingly frustrating was the notion that the friendship could be the end all and be all for them. While they both agreed to try to build their friendship for now to avoid distractions while in training, the thoughts of their make-out sessions lingered, and only distracted them more. Floating banter, quips and comebacks, and lingering stares they would catch each other in throughout the day. All of it caused the tension to rise. And any time they accidentally grazed the other's skin, the same electricity was there, but it was more intense because they were actively trying to deprive themselves. The increased closeness of the pair and intense gazes did not go unnoticed by the rest of the group. I swear you can hear their thoughts out loud sometimes, Wanda would often say. I am not an innocent girl by any means, but even I blush when I see the way Rogers looks at Romanoff, Maria would comment. The men usually saved their banter for when they were alone with Rogers, as seldom as it was anymore. Get a room, man. Rhodey, Loki, and Thor would often say if they overheard them flirting. Bruce would look embarrassed and not say anything. Tony had made amends for his behaviour at the fire for the most part over the first month, but it didn't stop him from telling Steve, make sure you prepare for the fireworks that are going to go off with Rogers. I don't know if you can handle that. Steve and Natasha tried to laugh them all off, but beneath their appearance of being in control, they both felt the exact things their friends were saying. Sam was becoming closer as a roommate to Steve and Bucky, so they both caught onto Steve's frustration in the past couple of weeks. At first, they joked like the others about Steve and Natasha just needing to break their sexual dam already. But Bucky could tell most recently, Steve's frustration ran deeper than just the attraction to Romanoff. As a reward for successfully completing the first month at the academy, Fury gave the trainees a night off where they could go out, off campus. The men and women in the group of 11 had agreed to separate for the night. Natasha and Steve had talked about skipping it to hang out on campus with each other, but they caved to the pressure of their friends and decided to part ways for the evening. Bucky, Sam, and Steve were getting ready in their room when Sam spoke. Do you ever think Romanoff is a master of deflection? Steve immediately became defensive. He threw his towel on the floor in answer. What is that supposed to mean? Sam and Bucky recently had a conversation about this exact question, and the source of Steve's rising frustration and wearing patience. But Bucky knew his brother well enough to know that it was one thing for Steve to be having these thoughts poke holes in his built-up idea of Natasha. He could stay in denial about that. It was quite another for his friend and his brother to bring it up. That meant whatever doubt or concern he was feeling was noticeable to others too, and it meant it was real. Bucky asked Steve a couple nights ago when they found a rare moment when it was just the two of them, if everything was all right. He was noticeably lost in his thoughts, so Steve didn't answer at first, and then just nodded before changing the subject. What Bucky didn't know was that it was the same day that Steve thought he overheard Natasha say a word in Russian. Bucky could tell then that something was bothering his brother, and it had only increased now. He stepped in and waved Sam off. "Look, Steve, I know I've asked before, and you just say she is private. But come on. You and I know a line of bullshit when we see it. And I am calling bullshit on that. I mean, I can be private." Steve had calmed down and laughed. "Buck, you read about as private as a nudist colony." That had calmed the mood, and all three men started laughing. Bucky grinned. "See, that's what I am talking about. You just called bullshit on me. You're right. I am not private. But you, on the other hand, you tend to hold your cards close to the vest. But I bet Romanoff knows about our childhood and how we became brothers. I bet she knows about Mom and that she is a nurse. Fuck, Steve, I bet she knows 1,000 things about you. What do you really know about her?" Bucky knew that he was about the only person who could get away with what he was doing while Steve would stay put and listen. It wasn't Bucky's first attempt at this conversation, but it was the most direct approach. Sam knew he could stay, and neither Bucky or Steve would be upset. He had the same concerns as Bucky did, but he knew this discussion should be between them as he waved and said, "See you downstairs in a bit," and he stepped out of their room. Steve narrowed his eyes at his brother. "Buck, you and I have learned by now that all of that type of information is just demographic and superficial. Knowing someone's mother's occupation doesn't matter." Bucky sat down and stretched his legs out in front of his chair and crossed his arms behind his head, looking like he had 0 fucks to give. This conversation was happening, and Steve wasn't getting away with this BS with him anymore. They'd been here a month, and sure, they saw each other and spoke every day, countless times. But they hadn't had a real moment like this since before they came to Quantico. As big of a punk as Steve could be, Bucky could equal the level in being a jerk right back to him. That's how they always interacted and called each other out when needed. Bucky was calling Steve out. "Steve, the sentence is about as twisted as the logic behind it. I am not talking about you not knowing Natasha's parent's jobs. It was a metaphor. I don't use words that you don't know the meaning to, Buck," Steve said as he gave a slight smile. "Their arguments always went this way. Serious, but full of jabs. They loved each other and knew how to get through to one another. They could push each other's buttons without tempers being lost, unlike with other people." Bucky faked being offended and scoffed. "Hey man, I know what the word logic means." They knew Steve was referencing the word metaphor, which was a jab in itself, but it did the trick, and they relaxed. Steve sat on his twin bed and looked as his brother continued. "You know what I am talking about. So you can be in denial because you have the hots for Romanoff. I get it. You guys have this weird connection, and you just click. What do the old folks call it? Kismet. But Steve, it is me. I wasn't referring to superficial details. I was referring to how you are convincing yourself that this is all normal and she is just private, and you're really going to be patient until she opens up. I think we both know that she is not the type of person to open up, and that is what is frustrating you. You trust her, but why doesn't she trust you enough to tell you more than what she likes to eat?" Steve's head hung between his slumped shoulders. He huffed out a breath and said, "Buck, everything you've said, yeah, I've thought about it. And yeah, I do get frustrated. Is that what you want to hear?" Bucky was still sprawled out in his chair. He wasn't going to give Steve that easy of an out. He raised both eyebrows, silently telling him, "Go on." "Oh my God. How did Mom make it with the two of us as kids? You as stubborn as me. Do you know that, Buck?" Bucky just grinned as Steve continued. "Yeah, I have questions and concerns. And it is frustrating, but what I can tell you is that the answers to those questions, whatever they are, aren't going to change how I feel. Those answers won't tell me what type of woman she is. My experiences with her do that. She will tell me on her terms, when she wants to, but I am not going to pressure her." Bucky wanted to say, "Bullshit again." He didn't. He smacked his hands on his knees and stood up to finish getting ready. He put on his deodorant and cologne and said, "You sure you're not afraid of what she might say if you do actually pressure her?" Bucky was checking his teeth in the mirror as he heard Steve let out another irritated sigh as he continued, "Hey, I like Natasha. I really do, Steve. And I know if I am ever going on a mission with someone in the future, I would want her with me because damn, she can kick some serious ass. And I won't even get started on how much I love the ego check she gave Stark on night when everyone did." Steve smiled at him and let out a laugh as Bucky finished. "But look, all I am saying is before you go completely off the deep end with this girl, if you haven't already, you should be able to know a few basic things about her. You're my brother, and I am just trying to have your back. Steve stood up to finish getting dressed. I want to know all of the answers to my questions about Nat and her life, but she has to have her reasons for the privacy, and right now I respect that. I appreciate the concern, Buck, but I trust her, okay? Bucky relented and put his hands up. He may have been telling himself silently still, bullshit, Rogers, but he dropped it. He said his piece and trusted his brother. Okay then, whatever you say. Just know, I've always got your back, Steve. Bucky smacked his brother on the shoulders and wiggled his eyebrows. Now let us go have some fun. We've earned it. Steve nodded at Bucky as they left their room to go downstairs and meet everyone else for the night out. Steve and Bucky met up with the other men outside to wait for the cab. They started joking about who was going to be the first person to strike out with a girl, Bucky, because he was relentless, and who would be the first to pass out for the night, either Banner because he appeared to be a lightweight or Stark because he seemed like the type to overindulge. The women found their way down to wait for their separate cab as well. Steve caught a glimpse of Natasha from the corner of his eye as she approached with Wanda and Maria. His breathing hitched as he gave her appearance a scan from head to toe. None of the group had been particularly dressed up because no one had packed any fancy clothes for training, but it did not stop Steve from thinking Natasha looked stunning. She wore a pair of tight black jeans that might as well have been painted on her legs with her black high heels and a V-neck, dark grey sweater. It wasn't too revealing, but Steve immediately started thinking of what was underneath. He decoded a hint of her chest a couple of times in the boxing ring, and the images stirred in him, causing a warmth to creep up his neck. Her hair was down in tame red waves, and he thought about the times when his hands were running through it. His throat felt tight as he swallowed nervously. Steve had never really seen Natasha make up, so he noticed immediately how the hints of gold and purple caused her eyes to pop, and how her red lipstick made her lips look even more luscious than usual. He wanted to take her plump lower lip into his mouth and suck. He could almost hear her moan. She stepped over to him as he separated from the men. She could tell he approved of her appearance. Her mind was right there in the gutter with his. Steve already knew how much Natasha loved to tease him. So, when she reached down to brush her fingertips over his hand, she whispered, "Cat got your tongue. You don't look bad yourself, Rogers." Steve grasped onto her fingers with his large hand and felt a little better about his intense reaction when he saw her cheeks blush. They were on a level playing field now. Steve was wearing black dress shoes with dark jeans that hugged his ass and thighs, and everything else that she remembered being pressed against the wall a month ago. She looked up to see he was wearing a black Henley shirt with 3 buttons. The top 2 were undone, revealing a glimpse of his beefy chest muscles. It didn't matter that she had seen flashes of his stomach and skin plenty of times in the ring when he de-wiped his face with his shirt. Right now, all she could do was think about running her tongue along the exposed flesh. Her blush deepened, and she felt her mouth start to water. She looked at the blue escaping from his eyes as he smirked at her. Her stare shifted when she saw a hint of silver around his neck. Steve saw the question behind her eyes, and he pulled out his old army tags. She let go of his hand and reached up to feel them as her nails grazed his neck. They locked eyes and both exhaled as she said, "I haven't seen these before." He grinned. "I don't have any fancy jewelry or gold chains like Stark over there." Natasha imagined the metal touching her skin with his large frame hovering over her. She tried to smack herself back to reality as she spoke to herself, "Oh my God, Romanoff, get a grip." They looked at their friends to find 9 pairs of eyes staring at them, hearing Bucky make a joke to Sam, Kismet and Maria, and want to say something about eye sex. Natasha let out a nervous laugh and said, "I wish we were going out together tonight, Steve." Steve knew he was going to get crap for this for the rest of the evening. But he stepped forward and let his hand reach for hers again. "Me too, Nat. Hey, you be careful tonight. You look too good to not have guys hitting on you." She raised an eyebrow at him. "You are not the jealous type, are you, Rogers? You know, I could say the same thing to you. I don't want to hear about you looking at any other girls tonight. You are going to get a lot of attention with how your arms look in that shirt." Feeling flushed, Steve heard Bucky cough loudly and Stark groan, "Good God." Wanda finally came over to link her arm in Natasha's. She smiled at Steve and said, "Okay, kids, time to detox and peel away for the night. Our cab is here and the fare is ticking." Wanda and Maria waved their hands at Natasha, faking an attempt at cooling her off while Steve was met with a chorus of rizzing from the men. They smiled one more time at each other as they went off in separate cabs for the evening. Thanks for listening to our 3 dubs. A huge thank you to 80s Kat for creating this incredible story. Be sure to check out their work for more amazing content. And special thanks to NC Nunn for providing the background footage that brought this narration to life. If you enjoyed this video, leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Until next time, happy listening and keep imagining.